They say the royal family has endured scandals, betrayals, and leaks that would shatter ordinary households. But nothing in modern history had prepared Buckingham Palace for this. Nothing, until Harry and Meghan. Until now. Imagine this. The corridors of the most iconic royal residence in the world, the very heart of centuries of tradition, filled with whispers of fury, disbelief, and betrayal. And at the center of it all, two people who promised loyalty and reverence for the institution. Now accused of systematically evading royal privacy in ways that even the palace could no longer tolerate. The question is simple. How far is too far when it comes to a royal stepping beyond the lines of family, protocol, and secrecy? The palace believes they've reached that point, and they're not just angry. They're suing. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story starts not in courtrooms or media headlines, but in the quiet, high-security halls of Buckingham Palace, where every frame of art, every ancient portrait, and every private photograph is meant to remain shielded from the public eye. Here, privacy isn't merely a preference, it's a necessity. Royal privacy protects reputations, legacies, and even lives. But over the past few years, that boundary has been tested like never before. By whom? By the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, whose charm, charisma, and celebrity appeal masked an increasingly complicated and fraught relationship with the institution they were born into and married into. The palace tolerated whispers, they endured interviews, and they even weathered explosive documentaries. But according to insiders, what happened next was the final straw. You might ask, what could possibly push Buckingham Palace from tolerance to litigation? What series of actions, no matter how bold or misguided, could provoke the royals to take the unprecedented step of suing their own family members? The answer is as shocking as it is complex. Leaks of private conversations, secret recordings, breaches of royal protocol that, to the average observer, might seem minor but, within the palace, are monumental violations. Each incident built on the last, a chain of events stretching from casual defiance to deliberate evasion. Every phone call, every private interview, every behind-the-scenes decision that bypassed the palace's oversight became another thread in a tapestry of betrayal. The palace's legal team, usually reserved, discreet, and patient, eventually decided that words were no longer enough. If privacy was to be enforced, if respect was to be reclaimed, action had to follow. And that action was a lawsuit. The timing of this lawsuit is critical. You may wonder, why now? Why strike when the media landscape is already so fraught with speculation, rumors, and leaks? Sources inside the palace suggest that recent incidents, including what some insiders describe as aggressive public appearances and strategic evasion of security protocols, forced the hand of the monarchy. Legal action was not a whim. It was a necessary assertion of authority. Buckingham Palace, a centuries-old institution, does not take legal battles lightly, and certainly not against its own. But when rules meant to safeguard private life, family cohesion, and national heritage are ignored, the consequences escalate. For Harry and Meghan, this isn't just another tabloid controversy. This is a reckoning. Now, let's talk about the personal stakes. Because beyond the legal arguments and court filings, there is a deeply human story here. A story of family tension, of pride, of betrayal, and of love complicated by fame and ambition. The palace, sources say, is hurt. Not just by public slights, but by actions taken behind closed doors. Picture a family gathering, a moment meant for celebration, suddenly shattered by mistrust. Imagine seeing private details of your life, moments meant for laughter and intimacy, displayed to millions across the globe. The palace claims that Harry and Meghan's choices weren't mistakes, they were deliberate. And deliberate actions, in this context, carry consequences. And yet, Harry and Meghan have their own narrative. They've framed their journey as a quest for freedom, for a life outside the constraining walls of royal expectation. They have won sympathy, admiration, and attention from around the world. But here lies the paradox: freedom versus obligation, celebrity versus duty, personal narrative versus collective legacy. Where does one draw the line? The palace says they drew it decades ago, and the Sussexes crossed it repeatedly. The public sees a couple claiming liberation. The palace sees a breach of trust. Two perspectives, two truths, and now, a high-stakes legal confrontation that may redefine the boundaries of royal life forever. The lawsuit itself is loaded with intrigue. What exactly does it entail? Official documents have yet to be fully released, but insiders reveal a range of claims. Unauthorized media disclosures, evasion of palace security procedures, and even the strategic use of private communications to gain public attention. In short, the palace alleges that Harry and Meghan didn't just step over the line. They leapt, fully aware of the consequences. And the emotional impact? Massive. Royals, staff, and longtime confidants are reportedly in shock, grappling with the reality that the very people meant to protect and uphold family dignity may have undermined it from within. To understand this story fully, you have to see the pattern. Consider the interviews, the memoirs, the documentaries, and the public appearances. Each action may appear harmless in isolation, but when pieced together, a larger picture emerges, a deliberate push against the rules, a consistent effort to reshape the narrative on their own terms. And that narrative isn't just about them. It's about the monarchy itself, its image, and its place in a changing world. By challenging the unspoken rules of privacy and discretion, Harry and Meghan inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, provoked a reaction that historians argue is unprecedented in British royal history. This isn't a tabloid feud. It's a constitutional and familial confrontation. But there's more beneath the surface. Sources inside the palace suggest that behind every legal filing, there is a history of private attempts at reconciliation. Letters, meetings, and mediated conversations reportedly tried to resolve tensions quietly. Yet each gesture was met with resistance or deflection. The palace's patience, some insiders say, was tested to the absolute limit. And the tipping point? Allegedly, a series of recent events that violated both trust and explicit instructions from senior royal advisors. The legal team, who usually operate in shadows, concluded that this wasn't a matter for private negotiation, it required public accountability. The stakes couldn't be higher: reputation, family legacy, and the sanctity of privacy itself. Now, consider the public perspective. You might ask yourself, how should ordinary people react to a royal lawsuit? Is this just celebrity drama blown out of proportion? Or is there something deeper at play? To understand, you need to appreciate the symbolic nature of royal privacy. It's not simply about avoiding embarrassment. It's about controlling the narrative of a national institution, ensuring the safety of individuals, and maintaining centuries of protocol. By allegedly evading these rules, Harry and Meghan aren't just defying family. They're challenging the very structure that supports monarchy in the modern age. The palace sees this as a threat, not just to them, but to the institution itself. And that threat demanded action. And here's the part that will shock even the most seasoned royal watchers. According to insiders, the lawsuit was filed not just for damage control, but as a statement. A statement that even family is not exempt from consequences. That tradition, privacy, and protocol are not optional. That breaches, once tolerated, will now be met with decisive action. It's a legal message with layers of emotional resonance, a declaration of boundaries long ignored. And for Harry and Meghan, it signals a new chapter, one they may not be fully prepared for. So what does all of this mean for you, the viewer? Why should anyone outside Buckingham Palace care? Because this isn't just about one family or one lawsuit. It's about power, responsibility, and the delicate balance between public life and private reality. It's about watching history unfold in real time, with unexpected twists and deeply human consequences. And perhaps most importantly, it's about witnessing what happens when privilege, fame, and personal ambition collide with tradition, loyalty, and authority. The questions raised here go beyond gossip. They touch on the very nature of trust, family, and accountability. And just when you think you've grasped the magnitude of the story, the palace drops another bombshell. Something so unexpected that insiders say it shocked even the most seasoned advisors. A private document, a revelation about a personal interaction, a piece of evidence that could redefine everything. Harry and Meghan thought they were in control of the narrative. They weren't. The palace had been quietly preparing, strategically and methodically. The lawsuit wasn't just reactive, it was proactive, a preemptive strike designed to reclaim authority and control. And what came next? Well, that's where this story truly begins, and the twists, betrayals, and shocking revelations are only getting started. The next chapter will take us deeper into the breaking point. You'll see the exact moments, the private interactions, and the decisions that pushed Buckingham Palace from patience to action. You'll witness the escalating tension, the personal stakes, and the silent fury that led to a legal battle no one thought possible. And just when you think the drama can intensify, you'll discover that what happened behind the palace walls may change everything you thought you knew about this royal family. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The day the palace decided it had had enough didn't begin with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It began with silence. A silence so tense that even the portraits of long-dead monarchs seemed to watch in judgment. But behind that stillness, fury was brewing. A slow, deliberate, and unstoppable fury that had been accumulating for years. How had it come to this? How had Harry and Meghan, once celebrated as the youthful charm of the royal family, become the very source of unrest that shook Buckingham Palace to its core? The answers lie in a series of choices, each seemingly small on its own, but collectively catastrophic. It started with what insiders describe as incremental defiance. At first, it was subtle, a deviation from protocol here, a missed briefing there. Perhaps a casual comment to the media that, in isolation, seemed harmless. But in the palace, where rules exist to protect decades of tradition, even small deviations are magnified. Security protocols are there not just for safety, but to preserve dignity and control. When Harry and Meghan began evading these, quietly at first, the palace tolerated it. They hoped it was a phase, a rebellious streak that would fade. But then came the pattern. And patterns, when unchecked, become predictable. First, there were private communications shared with the press. Short messages, offhand remarks in interviews, nothing overtly explosive, but enough to rattle senior advisors. Every time the Sussexes stepped outside the rules, it sent a ripple through the palace. Staff whispered in hallways. Confidential meetings were convened. And every whisper fed into a growing sense of betrayal. The breaking point wasn't a single event, it was a crescendo. Insiders point to a sequence of leaks, strategic media appearances, and, most importantly, the deliberate avoidance of palace-sanctioned procedures. Imagine a private dinner at Frogmore Cottage being discussed on social media within hours. Imagine private conversations being spun into public narratives, painting the royals in a negative light. Imagine advisors discovering that even the most sensitive, behind-the-scenes moments were no longer sacred. That's when the palace realized that discretion, patience, and private mediation had failed. And yet, the human element cannot be understated. The royals are not just an institution, they are a family. And families feel betrayal deeply. Sources reveal that senior members of the royal household were not simply frustrated. They were personally hurt. Private gestures, meant to maintain harmony, were ignored or manipulated. Letters offering reconciliation went unanswered. Meetings meant to resolve disputes ended with more tension than before. The palace's patience, long considered infinite, had a breaking point. And that point had been reached. The fury was calculated. It wasn't a tantrum or a public display. It was strategic. Lawyers were consulted. Advisors convened in secret. Every detail of Harry and Meghan's actions was analyzed, from interviews to private meetings to personal communications. The palace didn't act out of emotion alone. They acted with precision. The lawsuit was not a first strike. It was the culmination of years of preparation. Every breach, every violation, every act of evasion had been documented, catalogued, and prepared for legal action. Yet, the Sussexes remained unaware of the extent of the palace's response. While Harry and Meghan were planning public appearances, podcasts, and documentaries, the palace's legal team was quietly strategizing. What seems like chaos on the surface was methodical beneath. Every lawyer involved, every private investigator, every advisor understood the stakes. This wasn't just about privacy. It was about control, legacy, and sending a message that no one, not even family, could cross the lines of the monarchy without consequences. And then there was the psychological dimension. Sources inside the palace describe a sense of disbelief that slowly turned into anger. How could two people, so close, treat the institution with such disregard? How could private conversations, meant for reconciliation, be manipulated for public gain? How could loyalty be replaced by narrative control? Each question deepened the sense of betrayal, and each answer only fueled the palace's determination. The lawsuit was coming, and it wasn't going to be a small footnote. It was going to be a headline the world couldn't ignore. The breaking point also revealed the complexity of modern royal life. Gone are the days when protocols alone could control behavior. Harry and Meghan had media influence, public sympathy, and platforms that gave them unprecedented reach. They could bypass traditional checks. They could shape narratives before palace statements were even released. The palace had to adapt. The rules had to be enforced not just privately, but publicly. The lawsuit was the ultimate tool. A way to reclaim authority and assert that royal privacy was not optional, no matter how charismatic the violators. But here's the twist that few anticipated. While the palace was planning its legal move, Harry and Meghan were not merely defiant. They were strategic. They had anticipated scrutiny, they had prepared talking points, and they had cultivated public sympathy. What the palace saw as blatant disrespect, the Sussexes framed as pursuit of freedom and self-expression. And therein lay the tension. Two parties, each convinced of their righteousness, each operating from fundamentally different understandings of loyalty, privacy, and duty. The clash was inevitable. It all came to a head in a private review session with senior advisors. Sources describe a room filled with tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Legal teams presented evidence. Communications were dissected. Strategic recommendations were debated. And as the session ended, one phrase echoed in the minds of those present. Enough is enough. The phrase was simple, yet it carried centuries of authority. It was the line in the sand. The moment the palace transitioned from tolerance to action. And action meant one thing: the unprecedented decision to sue. No longer could breaches be tolerated. No longer could loyalty be assumed. The lawsuit would serve as both punishment and precedent. It would publicly assert boundaries, legally protect privacy, and send a message that even the Sussexes, beloved by parts of the public, were not above the rules. For the palace, this was not personal vendetta. It was institutional survival. And survival required visibility. Yet, for all its strategy, the lawsuit carried risks. The palace knew that making family conflict public could backfire. Public opinion could swing. Media narratives could twist facts. And the Sussexes, ever media-savvy, could turn the tables, painting the palace as oppressive or out of touch. The stakes were enormous, and the tension palpable. Each side had its weapons: legal authority, public opinion, media influence, and personal narrative. The battlefield was set, invisible yet highly consequential. And here's where the human drama escalates. Behind closed doors, relationships strained to the breaking point. Private communications, meant to mend fences, became sources of conflict. Former allies took sides. Staff members were caught between loyalty to the family and allegiance to the institution. The palace's corridors, once silent and orderly, were now charged with a quiet urgency, a sense that history was being written in real time, and every move could shift outcomes irreversibly. But perhaps the most compelling part of this story is what comes next. The lawsuit is just the beginning. Behind the legal filings lie personal confrontations, strategic leaks, and revelations that will challenge everything the public believes about Harry and Meghan, and even the monarchy itself. Secrets that were long buried, communications thought to be private, and actions that were meticulously planned all emerge as pieces of a puzzle the world is only beginning to see. And as the world waits, questions loom. How will Harry and Meghan respond? Will public opinion favor the palace or the couple? Can trust ever be rebuilt? Will the monarchy survive this unprecedented challenge to its authority, or has the institution been irrevocably changed? The breaking point has been reached. The lawsuit is filed. And the real drama, the one that will define this chapter of royal history, has only just begun. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When examining the escalating conflict between Harry, Meghan, and Buckingham Palace, it's impossible to understand the lawsuit without tracing back years of tension, misunderstandings, and unspoken frustrations. This story didn't erupt overnight. It was simmering beneath the surface, growing stronger with each incident, each media appearance, each perceived betrayal. To understand why the palace finally said enough, we need to examine the history. The pattern of actions that, when viewed together, make the current lawsuit inevitable. The tension can be traced to the very beginning of Harry and Meghan's relationship, long before the first public controversy. Sources reveal that from the start, the couple had a different approach to royal life. Harry, familiar with the pressures of media scrutiny, was cautious yet increasingly assertive in shaping his narrative. Meghan, coming from Hollywood, was accustomed to controlling the story, using media strategically to maintain influence. When these two worlds collided, friction was inevitable. The palace, steeped in centuries of tradition, viewed such autonomy as a potential threat to its carefully maintained image and protocols. Early signs of tension were subtle. Imagine a royal protocol briefing, rules and procedures outlined in painstaking detail, designed to protect the family's image. Harry and Meghan occasionally skirted these procedures, not maliciously, but often out of a desire for spontaneity or independence. A private dinner, a casual media interaction, a statement made without clearance, all minor breaches individually, but collectively forming a pattern. Royal aides began noticing these small deviations stacking up, creating whispers of concern that would only grow louder over time. By the time of their engagement and wedding, the couple's relationship with the palace was already complex. While the public saw fairy tale moments and smiling portraits, the palace dealt with private negotiations, logistical concerns, and subtle conflicts over autonomy and privacy. Staffers recall meetings where every detail, from seating arrangements to public appearances, was debated and occasionally challenged. These internal debates might seem mundane to outsiders, but within the monarchy, even minor disagreements carry emotional weight. They signal differing values, priorities, and approaches, and over time, can lead to resentment. The tension intensified after the wedding, when the Sussexes began carving out their own public identity. Their media strategy, aimed at building a global profile, sometimes clashed with palace priorities. Interviews were conducted, statements released, and public appearances arranged without consultation, or at least with only partial disclosure. Each act, seemingly small in isolation, was interpreted by the palace as a test of authority, a challenge to centuries of carefully structured protocol. Advisors worried that if left unchecked, these actions could set a precedent for future royals, undermining the institution itself. The first major flashpoint, insiders claim, came with the infamous Oprah interview. While Harry and Meghan framed it as a candid discussion about personal struggles, mental health, and familial tensions, the palace viewed it differently. The interview, widely broadcast and dissected, revealed intimate details about private family life. Critics argued that airing grievances publicly violated unwritten rules of confidentiality and discretion. For the palace, it wasn't just a PR challenge, it was a breach of trust. And while public sympathy initially favored the couple, privately, the monarchy's reaction was one of shock and dismay. But the history of tension isn't only about high-profile moments. There were countless smaller incidents, each contributing to a growing sense of unease. Unauthorized disclosures to the press, selective reporting, and what insiders describe as media-managed appearances fueled frustration. Even the couple's charitable work, which might seem entirely positive, occasionally caused logistical headaches and conflicts over messaging. The pattern was clear. Harry and Meghan were increasingly operating outside the palace's control, and the palace was increasingly aware that their patience was finite. Family dynamics played a critical role in the buildup of tension. Sources reveal that private disagreements often spilled into public spaces, metaphorically and sometimes literally. Cousins, aides, and senior advisors found themselves mediating disputes that could have been handled privately, but the couple's media presence amplified these issues. For the palace, the frustration wasn't just procedural, it was emotional. They felt sidelined, disrespected, and above all, blindsided. Each public statement or appearance that contradicted internal discussions added layers of strain, making reconciliation increasingly difficult. The history of tension also highlights generational differences. Harry and Meghan represent a new approach to royal life. more global, more media-savvy, more willing to challenge tradition. The palace, representing centuries of precedent, values discretion, hierarchy, and subtle influence. These differing worldviews clashed repeatedly. What Harry and Meghan saw as transparency, the palace saw as exposure. What the couple considered freedom, the palace considered defiance. And over time, these differences hardened into entrenched positions, making compromise nearly impossible. By the time we arrive at the present lawsuit, several key patterns emerge from this history of tension. First, the Sussexes consistently prioritized public narrative over internal consultation. Second, their media strategy often conflicted with palace priorities. Third, the palace's attempts at private resolution, meetings, letters, mediated conversations, were frequently met with resistance or noncompliance. Finally, there was a recurring emotional element, a growing sense of personal betrayal that transformed procedural frustration into a deeply human grievance. This history also underscores the complexity of royal privacy in the digital age. Leaks are not merely accidental. They are amplified by global media, social platforms, and an ever-present public appetite for scandal. Actions that might once have remained private now have worldwide consequences within hours. For the palace, this means that minor deviations from protocol carry disproportionate weight. A seemingly innocuous comment by Harry or Meghan could cascade into a major controversy, affecting reputation, security, and legacy. The historical context shows that the palace's patience was not unlimited. The digital era simply accelerated the consequences of long-standing tensions. But what makes this history particularly dramatic is the interplay between public perception and private reality. To the outside world, Harry and Meghan's story is often framed as a struggle for independence, a fairy tale of modern love confronting centuries-old tradition. Inside the palace, however, the narrative is one of repeated boundary crossing, calculated risk-taking, and perceived disloyalty. These two narratives exist simultaneously, creating a volatile tension that no public statement can fully resolve. Understanding this duality is key to appreciating why the palace ultimately took the extraordinary step of legal action. And yet, even as tensions escalated, there were moments of hope. Private letters of reconciliation, offers to mediate disputes, and behind-the-scenes meetings aimed at finding common ground show that the palace initially sought resolution through diplomacy. But the history of tension reveals a sobering truth. Repeated breaches, combined with media-savvy maneuvering, made reconciliation increasingly unlikely. What might have been handled quietly and discreetly was now exposed, public, and legally actionable. The buildup of tension also highlights the emotional stakes. This was not just a dispute over protocol or procedure. It was about trust, respect, and familial bonds. Sources inside Buckingham Palace describe moments of heartbreak, where senior members questioned how private family interactions could be treated as tools for public influence. The emotional weight of these incidents cannot be understated. They add depth to the narrative, showing that this lawsuit is as much about human relationships as it is about legal boundaries. And as we trace the history of tension to its peak, one thing becomes clear. The palace's decision to sue was not sudden, nor was it impulsive. It was the result of years of accumulated frustration, repeated breaches, and escalating concern over the integrity of both family and institution. Every interview, every media appearance, every avoided protocol contributed to this moment. Every action, however small, became part of a larger pattern, a pattern that, in the palace's eyes, could no longer be ignored. By understanding this history, we can begin to appreciate the context of the lawsuit. We see that it is not merely a reaction to a single event, but a culmination of a long-standing conflict. A conflict rooted in generational differences, contrasting worldviews, and the pressures of public life. This history sets the stage for the dramatic confrontations, shocking revelations, and unprecedented legal actions that define the current crisis. And just when it seems like the pattern of tension might finally settle into predictability, an unexpected twist emerges, one that no one in the palace anticipated, one that changes the stakes entirely. The very people who were thought to be allies and confidants have been quietly feeding information to media outlets, amplifying conflicts and reshaping narratives behind the palace's back. What appeared to be a clear history of tension now takes on a new dimension, one of hidden agendas, secret communications, and betrayal. The legal battle, it turns out, is only part of a much larger story. And just as the palace braced for its next move, Harry and Meghan were preparing theirs. Actions that would further test loyalties, escalate tensions, and set the stage for a confrontation the monarchy had never faced before. But what came next would shock even the most seasoned royal insiders and change everything about how the world perceives the Sussexes. Behind every legal battle lies a mountain of evidence, carefully collected, scrutinized, and preserved. In the case of Buckingham Palace versus Harry and Meghan, this evidence was more than just paperwork. It was a revelation. A private trove of communications, documents, and recordings that the palace claims exposed repeated breaches of trust, deliberate evasion of protocol, and actions that could no longer be overlooked. What the public has seen in headlines and sound bites is only the tip of the iceberg. The real story is hidden in the layers of secret evidence that the palace had been quietly compiling. The collection of evidence began quietly, methodically, and without fanfare. Advisors, legal teams, and palace officials worked in unison, meticulously cataloging incidents that spanned years. Every interview given by Harry and Meghan, every unauthorized media appearance, and every leaked private communication was documented. According to insiders, the palace treated this not just as a record for legal purposes, but as a comprehensive account of behavior that endangered privacy, reputation, and family cohesion. In essence, they were constructing a detailed map of defiance. The nature of the evidence is both complex and shocking. It ranges from digital communications, emails, text messages, and encrypted messages, to private documents and schedules that should have remained confidential. Some of the material reportedly includes recordings of conversations with senior advisors, letters exchanged between family members, and even media scripts that had been shared without clearance. For the palace, these items were proof of a pattern, not isolated mistakes, but a sustained and deliberate disregard for protocol. What makes this evidence particularly explosive is its specificity. Sources reveal that there were multiple incidents where Harry and Meghan allegedly bypassed security protocols to gain exclusive media coverage. For instance, private engagements meant to be off the record were leaked, sometimes within hours. Invitations extended to media personnel, intended as controlled publicity, were manipulated to create narratives favoring the couple. Every deviation, insiders claim, was tracked, cataloged, and cross-referenced, revealing a pattern that could not be ignored. Beyond the procedural violations, the evidence also highlights moments of personal betrayal. Private conversations between the Sussexes and senior royal advisors, intended to resolve disputes or clarify intentions, were allegedly shared with journalists or selectively leaked for public consumption. Sources describe a growing sense of alarm within the palace. The very channels meant for reconciliation were being used strategically to advance the couple's narrative. For the institution, this wasn't just a breach of privacy, it was a direct challenge to trust. Perhaps the most startling element of the evidence is the discovery of communications that seemed to indicate premeditation. Palace investigators allegedly found that Harry and Meghan were not merely reacting impulsively. They were planning media appearances, interviews, and public disclosures in a manner that circumvented palace oversight. One insider described it as a calculated media campaign with private life as its script. To the palace, this revealed a level of strategic defiance that went beyond frustration or misunderstanding. It suggested intentional evasion. The evidence also included financial and legal documentation. Certain expenditures, charitable donations, and organizational decisions were allegedly made without informing senior palace officials. While the amounts involved may seem minor compared to the broader wealth of the royal family, insiders emphasize that it's not about money. It's about control, accountability, and protocol. Even the smallest deviation, when part of a pattern, became critical evidence in the palace's case. Then there are the recordings. Sources indicate that in some instances, conversations intended to remain private were captured either by aides or as part of security measures, and these recordings revealed not just procedural violations, but also candid discussions about the palace itself. Statements allegedly made in confidence, some expressing frustration or strategic intent, were preserved as part of the growing body of evidence. While the Sussexes team may have considered these conversations inconsequential, to the palace, they formed a mosaic of betrayal, showing intentions that were otherwise hidden from view. Perhaps the most emotionally charged evidence involves personal letters and messages exchanged within the family. Insiders reveal that some of these documents were intended to offer reconciliation or to clarify boundaries. Instead, the palace alleges they were ignored, delayed, or even referenced publicly without context. Each act, each omission, became a point in the palace's argument, a demonstration that private communication, a cornerstone of trust within the family, was being manipulated. The meticulous nature of the palace's evidence gathering also demonstrates the seriousness with which they approached this case. Legal teams worked alongside advisors and archivists to ensure that every incident was documented with context, dates, and corroboration. The goal was not only to build a strong legal case, but also to protect the integrity of the institution. Every memo, every record, every digital file was cross-checked to create an airtight narrative that could withstand public scrutiny. And yet, the existence of this evidence raises questions. How will the public perceive it? Will it vindicate the palace, or will it be spun as an overreach? This tension adds a psychological layer to the legal battle. The Sussexes have public sympathy, media influence, and platforms that allow them to respond instantaneously. The palace, while armed with detailed evidence, faces the challenge of presenting its case without appearing punitive or vindictive. The stakes are immense, not just legally, but reputationally. In addition, some sources hint at the existence of highly sensitive materials that could potentially shift public opinion dramatically. Documents and communications that have never been seen outside the palace reportedly contain details that, if revealed, would challenge widely held perceptions of Harry and Meghan. The nature of these materials remains under strict confidentiality, but insiders describe them as the crown jewels of the palace's legal arsenal. Proof of actions and intentions that go far beyond what has been reported. The secret evidence also exposes the complex interplay between technology, media, and royal life. Harry and Meghan's adept use of social media, podcasts, and interviews allowed them to bypass traditional channels of communication. While these platforms offered unprecedented reach, they also became the very mechanisms through which the palace alleges privacy was compromised. Each public statement, each viral post, each selective disclosure contributed to a legal narrative demonstrating sustained evasion of authority. Yet, the existence of evidence alone does not tell the full story. What makes it explosive is not just its content, but its context. It reveals not only what happened, but why the palace reacted as it did. It exposes a pattern of behavior that, from the institution's perspective, required decisive intervention. And it sets the stage for an unprecedented confrontation, one where private actions collide with public perception, and where legal authority is leveraged to reclaim boundaries that had been repeatedly tested. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the secret evidence is what it suggests about the future. The palace reportedly uncovered communications that hint at potential future actions by the Sussexes, plans that, if executed, could further challenge privacy, authority, and protocol. This foresight is part of what makes the lawsuit more than a reaction. It is a preemptive move to protect the monarchy from repeated breaches. And the revelation of these potential future actions, once they eventually come to light, could shock the public and shift sympathies dramatically. The story of the secret evidence is more than a legal narrative, it's a psychological one. It illustrates the palace's perception of betrayal, the Sussexes' strategic maneuvering, and the high-stakes interplay between personal relationships and institutional authority. Each item in the archive, each recorded conversation, each leaked document tells a story of defiance, ingenuity, and miscalculated ambition. Together, they form a picture of a conflict that is as human as it is institutional, as emotional as it is legal. And just when it seems that the palace has revealed everything, insiders hint at yet another layer. Materials so sensitive that their eventual exposure could redefine public understanding of the royal family. The secret evidence is not just a tool for litigation. It is a narrative weapon, a means of shaping history, and a revelation waiting to unfold. But what came next would escalate the conflict in ways no one expected, turning a simmering tension into a full-blown confrontation, and leaving both Harry and Meghan and the palace itself on the brink of an unprecedented crisis. From the very beginning, Harry and Meghan cultivated a public persona that captured global attention. Charismatic, compassionate, and seemingly rebellious in the face of centuries-old tradition, they presented themselves as modern royals, an emblem of change and progressive ideals. Interviews, social media posts, and high-profile appearances reinforced a narrative of empowerment and personal freedom. But behind the cameras and curated statements, insiders suggest a very different reality. A private life defined by tension, strategic maneuvering, and repeated clashes with Buckingham Palace's rules and expectations. Understanding the gap between public persona and private reality is essential to grasp why the palace ultimately chose legal action. Harry's public image has long been that of the troubled but principled royal. The younger son of Diana, Princess of Wales, he is framed as someone who rebels against rigid tradition, often in the name of fairness, mental health awareness, or social advocacy. Meghan, on the other hand, entered the family with a Hollywood sensibility, media savvy, and a strong sense of autonomy. Together, they became symbols of a modern monarchy, bridging the gap between celebrity culture and royal duty. Their public image radiated charm, sophistication, and an aura of benevolent rebellion. But according to sources, this carefully constructed persona often masked a more complicated private reality. Privately, Harry and Meghan reportedly operated with a sense of urgency and strategy that differed dramatically from their public-facing narrative. Advisors claimed that many decisions were calculated, aimed at shaping public opinion, and carefully timed to coincide with media coverage. Private interactions with senior palace officials, intended to address protocol or clarify boundaries, were sometimes manipulated for public consumption or selectively leaked. The disconnect between public statements and private actions created tension that, over time, the palace found unsustainable. This duality is most evident in the couple's media appearances. While public interviews often highlighted struggles with the monarchy or challenges faced by Meghan, private communications allegedly revealed a different level of deliberation. Sources say the couple planned interviews with precision, often coordinating statements in advance, anticipating the reactions of both media and palace insiders. To the public, these moments were candid and heartfelt. To the palace, they were strategic breaches of trust, designed to advance a personal narrative over institutional loyalty. One key element in the divide between public and private reality is the management of personal grievances. Publicly, Harry and Meghan emphasized struggles with the media and the pressures of royal life, framing themselves as victims of circumstance. Privately, according to insiders, they were also strategic actors, documenting conversations, tracking events, and building a portfolio of instances that could be used to support their narrative. While the public narrative projected vulnerability and humanity, the private reality suggested calculated self-interest. The discrepancy between public and private life was further compounded by selective transparency. The Sussexes were praised for openness in interviews, podcasts, and social media, yet much of what they disclosed publicly had been carefully curated. Information beneficial to their image was emphasized, potentially compromising details were withheld. The palace perceived this as manipulative, arguing that the couple's selective storytelling undermined trust and distorted the truth about their interactions with the royal institution. Financial and organizational activities also played into this duality. While public statements emphasized charitable work, humanitarian efforts, and advocacy, insiders claimed that many behind-the-scenes decisions regarding expenditures, event planning, and organizational strategy were made without palace approval. These actions, while potentially well-intentioned, reinforced the perception of autonomy at the expense of collaboration and compliance. The palace, trained over centuries to value consultation and hierarchy, viewed this independence as a breach of protocol. The psychological dimension of this disconnect is equally important. The palace reportedly felt blindsided by the disparity between the couple's public persona and private behavior. Trust, once central to family and institutional relationships, was repeatedly tested. Advisors who attempted to reconcile issues privately were sometimes met with resistance, delay, or misrepresentation. For those within Buckingham Palace, this wasn't just a question of procedure. It was a question of character, loyalty, and the fundamental nature of family bonds. Public perception, however, complicated matters. Harry and Meghan's carefully curated image garnered global admiration, especially among younger audiences and media outlets sympathetic to their narrative. This external support often clashed with the palace's internal assessment, creating a feedback loop where the couple's public popularity shielded them from scrutiny, while private concerns escalated behind closed doors. Advisors struggled to reconcile these competing realities, the external praise for the Sussexes versus the internal record of protocol violations and secrecy. This gap between public and private was not limited to major interviews or high-profile appearances. Even day-to-day life, from private events to informal conversations, reportedly revealed a persistent tension. Sources describe moments where instructions from the palace were circumvented, details of private gatherings were shared externally, and communications intended to mediate disputes were leveraged for strategic advantage. These small, repeated deviations accumulated into a broader pattern of perceived defiance, one that would ultimately feed the palace's legal strategy. The Sussexes' digital presence amplified this divergence. Every Instagram post, every public statement, every viral moment was crafted to reinforce a persona that highlighted freedom, empathy, and modernity. Yet the palace alleges that many of these moments were carefully timed to overshadow private warnings or internal guidance. The control exerted over public perception, in other words, came at the expense of private trust and compliance with institutional norms. For the palace, this imbalance was unsustainable. Another critical aspect of this duality is the handling of sensitive topics. Publicly, the couple emphasized issues like mental health, media intrusion, and racial sensitivity. Privately, sources claim, they sometimes used these topics as leverage in internal discussions, positioning themselves strategically to advance personal objectives or justify breaches of protocol. While this approach enhanced their public credibility, it heightened tension within the palace, where discretion and hierarchy are foundational principles. And yet, it's important to note that this duality isn't purely malicious. From the Sussexes' perspective, their public persona was a lifeline, an attempt to maintain autonomy, personal agency, and a sense of purpose outside the rigid framework of royal life. Their actions were framed as necessary for survival, self-expression, and advocacy. But from the palace's perspective, the gap between persona and reality represented repeated disregard for family, tradition, and institutional integrity, a gap that could no longer be ignored. Ultimately, the tension between Harry and Meghan's public image and private behavior illuminates the underlying cause of the lawsuit. This isn't merely a dispute over protocol. It's a conflict rooted in perception, trust, and power. The palace's legal action is as much about asserting boundaries and preserving privacy as it is about reconciling the stark contrast between the couple's curated image and behind-the-scenes actions. And just when the palace thought it had fully documented and understood this duality, a new revelation emerged, one that could alter the stakes entirely. Internal sources claim that private communications suggest the Sussexes may have anticipated the lawsuit, potentially planning responses, media strategies, and public narratives in advance. The realization that the couple might have been one step ahead all along intensified the palace's resolve and set the stage for a legal battle that is as psychological as it is procedural. But what came next would push the divide between public persona and private reality into uncharted territory, and leave both sides scrambling for control in ways no one expected. The moment Buckingham Palace decided to take legal action against Harry and Meghan was not spontaneous. It was the result of years of careful observation, mounting frustration, and meticulous preparation. When the decision was finally made, it marked a dramatic turning point. The monarchy was no longer content to quietly tolerate repeated breaches of trust. It was ready to strike back. But this retaliation would be strategic, calculated, and unprecedented in scope. The world would soon witness a royal confrontation unlike anything in modern history. The first step in the palace's plan was internal consolidation. Senior advisors and legal teams convened in secure locations, away from prying eyes and potential leaks. Every incident involving the Sussexes was reviewed. Interviews, social media posts, charitable ventures, private letters, and communications with media outlets. Lawyers cross-referenced timelines, verified documentation, and prepared detailed dossiers. What might appear as a reactionary lawsuit to outsiders was, in fact, the culmination of months of preparation and strategic thinking. The palace was ready to defend its institution, authority, and privacy with an arsenal of evidence. But the strategy extended beyond legal maneuvering. Public perception had to be considered. The palace was acutely aware that the court of public opinion could tip either way. While the Sussexes had cultivated a global following, the monarchy had centuries of cultural authority, institutional gravitas, and a loyal base. The challenge was balancing legal rigor with careful media messaging. Advisors debated every press release, statement, and public-facing communication, ensuring that the palace projected professionalism, fairness, and restraint while asserting its boundaries. The stakes were immense. A misstep could escalate public scrutiny and compromise the monarchy's image. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Senior members reportedly experienced a mix of anger, disappointment, and resolve. What had once been tolerated, minor protocol breaches, selective disclosure of private communications, and media manipulation, was now actionable defiance. Staff and aides, long accustomed to subtle power dynamics, felt a shift in tone. The palace was no longer negotiating or appeasing. It was asserting authority, and the message was clear: royal privacy and institutional integrity were non-negotiable. Legal action was the most visible manifestation of this strategy. The palace's lawyers drafted filings detailing specific incidents, presenting evidence of repeated evasion of protocols, breaches of confidentiality, and unauthorized public disclosures. Each entry was carefully curated to establish a pattern. A series of deliberate, coordinated actions that undermined trust and violated the unspoken rules of royal life. While the lawsuit would be filed publicly, the documents were prepared to withstand intense scrutiny, anticipating the inevitable media storm. But legal strategy alone was insufficient. Buckingham Palace also leveraged internal communications to maintain discipline and cohesion among staff. Advisors, security teams, and palace officials were briefed on the situation, ensuring that everyone understood the stakes, protocols, and messaging. Rumors were rampant outside the palace walls, and controlling internal narratives was crucial to prevent leaks that could compromise the case. The palace's approach combined discipline, precision, and foresight, every move carefully calculated to reinforce authority and credibility. At the same time, the palace monitored Harry and Meghan's public activities closely. Every podcast, interview, and media appearance was analyzed for potential legal implications and narrative impact. Advisors sought to understand the couple's strategy, anticipate their next moves, and prepare countermoves. This high-stakes surveillance wasn't about invasion. It was about anticipating escalation and protecting the monarchy from repeated challenges to its authority. The dynamic was tense. Two parties operating simultaneously in legal, media, and emotional arenas, each trying to outmaneuver the other. The palace's strategy also involved subtle signaling. While the lawsuit would eventually become public, initial actions were discreet. Letters were sent, warnings delivered privately, and private negotiations attempted, but with a firmness that left no room for ambiguity. The palace was signaling both resolve and reason. There was a path to reconciliation, but repeated breaches could no longer be tolerated. The messaging was clear: boundaries exist, and the institution will enforce them. As the legal strategy developed, the palace also prepared for public reaction. Experts in media, public relations, and crisis management were consulted to shape a narrative that balanced authority with empathy. Statements were drafted to emphasize privacy, family unity, and institutional integrity, while avoiding overt attacks on Harry and Meghan. The goal was to protect the monarchy's image, prevent a public relations backlash, and frame the lawsuit as a necessary step to defend the family and institution, not as a personal vendetta. Internal sources describe the emotional intensity of this period as extraordinary. staff felt the weight of history and tradition pressing down, knowing that the actions taken now could define the monarchy for years to come. Advisors debated the potential fallout, weighing risks against the need to assert control. The palace had to act decisively, yet carefully, balancing legal necessity with the delicate optics of family conflict in the public eye. But the palace's strike wasn't limited to legal filings and strategic communications. Behind the scenes, investigators worked to uncover patterns and establish context for the breaches. Documents, messages, and recorded interactions were analyzed for motive, frequency, and impact. The goal was to create a cohesive narrative that demonstrated not just individual infractions, but systemic defiance. Every detail mattered. Dates, locations, wording, and context all contributed to the overall story. The combination of legal rigor, strategic communications, and meticulous investigation reflected a mindset shaped by centuries of precedent. Buckingham Palace had faced crises before, but the challenge posed by Harry and Meghan was unprecedented. The lawsuit was not only about individual actions, it was about the very principles that sustain the monarchy: privacy, discretion, loyalty, and institutional authority. The palace's response had to reinforce these principles while maintaining public credibility, a delicate balance that required extraordinary precision. And yet, even with such careful planning, there were unforeseen complications. The global media landscape, social media scrutiny, and the couple's vast public support meant that every move had the potential to backfire. Advisors described tense moments when leaked documents, speculative reporting, or viral commentary threatened to undermine the palace's carefully crafted strategy. The legal and public relations teams had to react quickly, recalibrating messaging, reinforcing internal discipline, and anticipating the next wave of media reaction. The palace's strike was, in essence, multidimensional. It combined law, narrative, psychology, and strategy. The message was unmistakable. The era of tolerance was over. Harry and Meghan's actions had consequences. Royal privacy would be defended, and breaches would be met with decisive response. For the first time in modern history, the monarchy had moved from private tolerance to public assertion of authority, and the implications would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. And just as the palace executed this unprecedented strike, the Sussexes were not passive. Behind the scenes, they reportedly coordinated their own media strategy, prepared legal countermoves, and leveraged public sympathy to anticipate the palace's action. The stage was set for a confrontation that was as much psychological and narrative-driven as it was legal. Every decision, every statement, every leak would now carry outsized significance. But what came next would escalate the confrontation to a level that neither side fully anticipated, turning a legal dispute into a full-blown international spectacle, and forcing both the palace and the Sussexes into a high-stakes game, with history watching every move. The moment the first court filings were made, the story transformed from palace whispers and insider speculation into a public spectacle that gripped the world. Legal documents that had been meticulously prepared behind closed doors were suddenly exposed to global scrutiny, revealing allegations, evidence, and narratives that no one outside Buckingham Palace had seen. What had been an internal battle over trust, privacy, and protocol now became a legal confrontation with consequences extending far beyond the family itself. The filings were comprehensive, precise, and unprecedented. Lawyers for the palace outlined a detailed chronology of events spanning years, highlighting repeated breaches of privacy, unauthorized communications, and deliberate avoidance of established protocols. Each claim was accompanied by supporting evidence: emails, letters, security reports, and internal notes. In essence, the palace presented a case not only about specific actions, but also about a pattern of behavior that, in its view, undermined both the family and the institution. From the outset, the filings were designed to achieve multiple objectives. Legally, they established the palace's claim of a sustained violation of privacy. Publicly, they signaled seriousness, authority, and resolve. The documents carefully walked the line between assertiveness and professionalism, avoiding personal attacks while presenting the facts as clearly and convincingly as possible. For those following the unfolding drama, It was a rare glimpse into the inner workings of an institution historically shielded from scrutiny. One of the most striking aspects of the filings was the level of detail. Each allegation was meticulously documented, with dates, communications, and context carefully cited. Instances of unauthorized media appearances were noted alongside references to private letters and internal discussions. Even seemingly minor protocol violations were included, not for their individual significance, but to demonstrate a consistent pattern of disregard for palace rules. To the palace, this approach made the argument unassailable. It wasn't about a single mistake, it was about repeated defiance. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Headlines around the world splashed dramatic phrases. Palace takes legal action against Harry and Meghan, royal privacy under attack, and monarchy versus Sussex, court showdown. Analysts dissected the filings, debating every allegation, while social media erupted with commentary, speculation, and heated debate. For the palace, managing public perception became as critical as the legal case itself. Every statement, every press release, and every response had to be calibrated to maintain credibility and authority. But beyond the headlines, the filings revealed deeper tensions. Internal communications cited in court painted a picture of repeated attempts at private resolution, ignored letters, and confidential meetings that ended in frustration. Advisors described moments where the Sussexes' actions appeared strategic, planned leaks, selective disclosures, and media coordination that seemed to anticipate palace responses. The filings were not just a legal strategy. They were a narrative of perceived betrayal and institutional defense.